We don't need old men like you dragging us down. Arthur, she'd said, her voice as sharp as the new, unwelcoming decor in her father's old office. The words, delivered by Veronica Sterling, with a dismissive flip of her perfectly styled hair, seemed to hang in the air, sucking the warmth from the room Arthur Jenkins had known for 18 years. He was 59, the operations manager at Midwest Precision Works, a company that manufactured industrial equipment for half the factories in the heartland. He wasn't a man for grand speeches or demanding the spotlight in meetings. He was the steady hand, the quiet diligence that kept the gears turning, the institutional knowledge that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. As Veronica spoke, dismissing him as if swatting a fly, Arthur felt a strange calm settle over the initial shock. He just smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, nodded once, and walked out. No arguments, no threats, no drama. He methodically cleared his desk, the younger staff averting their eyes, some of whom he'd hired as teenagers, now men and women with families, every single one trained by him. Nobody said a word as he packed nearly 2 decades of his life into a cardboard box. George Sterling, Veronica's father, had built Midwest Precision Works with his own hands 43 years ago, starting with a single lathe in his garage, growing it into a $30 million business through sheer grit and an unwavering reputation for reliable machinery. It was George who had handpicked Arthur to run operations when his own health began to falter. "You're the only one I trust not to cut corners. Arthur," he'd said, his voice earnest. Now, his daughter, Veronica, all of 28, armed with a business degree and 2 years of Miami living, had decided the company needed modernization and fresh perspectives. A euphemism, Arthur knew, for getting rid of anyone who remembered how things were done before algorithms supposedly replaced common sense. As he walked to his truck, carrying that pathetic box of personal items, a strange calm persisted, because what Veronica, in her youthful haste, didn't know, what she hadn't even bothered to check, was that his employment contract, the one George himself had insisted upon years ago to keep him from being poached by competitors, contained a very specific clause, a severance penalty, clear as day, 2 full years' salary if he was terminated without documented cause. What was going through his mind right then? I wonder, was it the sting of betrayal, the years of dedicated service tossed aside like yesterday's news? Or was it the quiet, grim satisfaction of knowing about that one, crucial detail she'd so carelessly overlooked? Before we dive deeper into how Arthur Jenkins navigated this unexpected, unwelcome crossroads, let me share a little about the man George Sterling had once called the bedrock of Midwest Precision Works, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth, even when others try to tear it down. He placed the box on the passenger seat and for a minute just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, he could see the production floor, the equipment he'd maintained, the systems he'd implemented, the people he'd hired, all of them, he thought, about to learn what happens when institutional knowledge walks out the door. He didn't slam his truck door, didn't screech out of the parking lot. He just turned the key, put the truck in drive, and headed home. The first call on his mind already decided. Henry Phillips, his lawyer and friend. The drive home wasn't filled with rage, not the sputtering, red-faced kind anyway, but a strange, unsettling calm, the kind that settles before a storm you know you have to weather. Each familiar turn, each landmark on the route Arthur Jenkins had driven for 18 years, to and from Midwest Precision Works, felt different today, tinged with a finality he was still processing. His mind wasn't replaying Veronica Sterling's callous words as much as it was drifting back, further back, to the early days. He remembered George Sterling, not the frail man he'd become, but George in his prime, sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands, a booming laugh that could fill the entire shop floor. George, who during Arthur's interview all those years ago, when Arthur was 41 and coming off a layoff from a dying automotive plant with little more than hands-on experience and a community college degree in mechanical engineering, had looked him square in the eye and said, "Credentials don't build machines. Arthur, men with sense and skill do." And George had taken a chance on him, promoting him to operations manager within 2 years. They weren't the types to go fishing together or hit the bar after work. He and George. Theirs was a respect forged in shared challenges, in late nights spent coaxing life out of stubborn machinery, in the mutual satisfaction of a complex order fulfilled perfectly. On time, Arthur recalled, with a pang, when his wife, Eleanor, had gotten sick, cancer. The word still felt like a stone in his gut, even 4 years after she was gone. George had been the one to quietly rearrange Arthur's schedule, without Arthur even asking, ensuring he could take Eleanor to every single treatment, every doctor's appointment. Family first, Arthur, always, George had said, his voice gruff but his eyes kind. That was the George Sterling he knew, the man who understood that a business was more than just profit margins and production quotas. It was about people, about loyalty, about a shared human experience. How could that same man, he wondered, stand by and let his daughter, a woman who seemed to value a fresh manicure over a well-oiled machine, dismantle everything he'd built, starting with the people who had helped him build it? This modernization Veronica was so keen on. Arthur had seen the early signs. About a year ago, she'd started showing up at meetings, fresh out of business school, carrying a sleek leather portfolio and trailing a cloud of expensive perfume that seemed to clash with the honest smell of oil and metal that usually permeated Midwest. She'd talk about synergy and market disruption, her buzzwords falling flat in a room full of men and women who understood the precise tolerance of a ball bearing. He'd catch George wincing sometimes at her suggestions, proposals that would have gutted their quality control or outsourced components they had always proudly made in-house, components that were the bedrock of their reputation for reliability. But George, already battling the heart problems that were slowly sapping his strength, never contradicted her publicly. "She needs to learn, Arthur," he'd told him one afternoon, leaning against Arthur's office doorframe, looking more tired than Arthur had ever seen him. "Some lessons can't come from books." Arthur had nodded, but a knot of unease had tightened in his stomach. And then, 3 months ago, George had announced his retirement. He'd looked defeated when he handed Arthur the updated organization chart with Veronica's name at the top. "I made her promise to keep the core team intact," George had said, not quite meeting Arthur's eyes. "The experience you all bring is what makes this place work." Arthur had just nodded again, but something in his gut told him George knew, or at least suspected, what was coming, and couldn't bring himself to say it. Pulling into his driveway, the familiar sight of his modest home, the one he and Eleanor had made together, offered a small comfort. He walked into the kitchen, the silence of the house amplifying the turmoil in his mind. He laid the employment contract, retrieved from his old briefcase, on the worn oak table. There, under Section 12, Paragraph 3, the clause Henry Phillips had helped him negotiate all those years ago, the clause George had readily agreed to, practically insisted on. He smoothed out the paper. His gaze drifted to a framed photo on the counter, him and Eleanor, smiling, on a trip to Lake Michigan, years before her illness. Beside it, a smaller, older photo of a much younger Arthur, standing with a robust George Sterling, both grinning, in front of the first big CNC machine Midwest had ever purchased. A wave of bittersweet nostalgia washed over him. This wasn't just about the money the clause guaranteed, though that was a significant cushion. It was about respect, about the value of a life's work, about a legacy he had helped build. He picked up the phone. "Henry," he said, when his friend answered, "It's Arthur. It finally happened. Yes, just like we talked about all those years ago. The clause is there, clear as day." He could almost hear Henry Phillips smile on the other end of the line. "Well, Arthur," Henry said, his voice calm and professional, but with an underlying note of a bulldog eager for a bone. "Let's make sure Miss Sterling understands the full value of experience, shall we? 18 years of loyalty, of shared history. Do you think George truly understood what he was losing, or what he had allowed to be lost, when he handed the reins to someone who only saw the numbers on a spreadsheet, and not the soul of the company he'd poured his life into? The pieces were in motion now, not for an emotional outburst, but for a measured, strategic response. The quiet storm Arthur had felt brewing within him was beginning to find its direction. The phone call from George Sterling came the next morning, his voice strained, a shadow of the confident leader Arthur Jenkins remembered. Arthur almost didn't answer it. The respect he'd held for George for 18 years didn't vanish overnight, but it was deeply bruised, battered by the previous day's events. Still, he picked up. "Arthur," George began, his voice raspy. "What the hell happened yesterday?" Arthur kept his tone neutral, not angry, just stating facts. "Ask your daughter, George." A pause stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. "I did," George finally said. "She said you were resistant to the new direction. Said you were undermining her authority with the floor team." Arthur said nothing, letting the silence hang. George knew him better than that. Knew he'd never undermine anyone, especially not in a company he'd helped build. He could picture George on the other end, likely rubbing his temples, the weight of his daughter's actions, and perhaps his own inaction, pressing down on him. "You're going to file, aren't you?" George asked, the question more a statement of weary resignation. "Already have, George," Arthur replied, his voice steady. "Henry Phillips is handling it." He heard George exhale heavily. "I told her to look at the contracts," George mumbled, almost to himself. "Told her before I stepped down that there were protections in place." Another pause. Then, "She said she cleaned house yesterday. You, Thomas Albright, Jennifer Hayes, anyone over 50. Arthur's jaw tightened. Thomas, their head of engineering for 12 years, a man who could coax miracles from aging machinery and design solutions that were both elegant and practical. Jennifer, who ran the quality control lab like it was her personal kingdom, whose meticulousness had saved them from countless costly errors, both irreplaceable in their own ways, both over 50, both now gone. "Is that the direction you wanted, George?" Arthur asked, the neutrality in his voice now tinged with a cold anger he couldn't entirely suppress. "Clearing out everyone who built the place with you." "You know it's not," George said, his voice tired, defeated. "But I gave her control. It's hers to run now." Arthur could hear voices in the background on George's end, one of them distinctly Veronica's, sharp and demanding. "I've got to go, George," he said quickly, and the call ended abruptly. Arthur set the phone down and stared at the contract spread across the table. Section 12, Paragraph 3. In the event of termination without documented cause as defined in Appendix C, employee shall be entitled to severance compensation equal to 24 months of current salary. Henry had highlighted it in yellow. "It's airtight, Arthur," Henry had told him earlier. "They'll either pay or we'll take them to court where we'll win, and they'll pay my fees. 2. Arthur walked to the window overlooking his backyard. The maple tree he and Eleanor had planted when they first moved in, 26 years ago, now towered over the property, its leaves just beginning to hint at autumn colors. They'd nurtured it through 2 lightning strikes and a disease that had nearly killed it. They'd patched it up, supported its weakened branches, given it what it needed to thrive. Something shifted inside him then. This wasn't just about money anymore, not just about the severance. It was about value, about recognizing what experience brings to the table, about respecting the foundation others built before you decided to sweep in and renovate the house with no regard for its structure. He picked up his phone again. First, he called Thomas Albright, then Jennifer Hayes, by noon. He'd spoken with every veteran employee Veronica had summarily dismissed. Some were shell-shocked, others furious. All of them were worried about their futures, about mortgages and college tuition and looming retirements that now seemed uncertain. "Take a breath," he told each of them. "Check your contracts, call Henry Phillips, he's expecting your calls." Then, he made one more call, a call that had been in the back of his mind for a while, even before Veronica's reign of error began. He dialed Douglas Clayton, the owner of Keystone Industrial Solutions, a smaller, more agile company across town. Douglas was a man who, like the old George Sterling, valued craftsmanship and innovation. He'd been trying to hire Arthur away from Midwest for years, impressed by his operational acumen. "Douglas," Arthur said when Clayton answered. "Arthur Jenkins, still interested in that conversation we had a few years back about specialized hydraulic components." There was a pause, then Douglas Clayton's hearty laugh. "Arthur, I was wondering when you'd see the light." Or, in this case, when they'd foolishly push you into it, "Yes, I'm still very interested. When can we talk?" As he hung up with Douglas, a new thought began to crystallize, a plan forming that was bolder than just collecting severance. Maybe this wasn't an ending at all. Maybe, just maybe, this was a different kind of beginning, a chance to build something new, something better, from the ground up, with people who understood the true meaning of value. But could he really pull it off, rally the old guard, and create something that could not only survive, but thrive in the shadow of Midwest's decline? The thought was daunting, but for the first time since Veronica's pronouncement, a spark of genuine excitement, of fierce purpose, ignited within him. 3 days later, Arthur Jenkins sat across from Veronica Sterling, Henry Phillips by his side, the air in the downtown law office thick with unspoken animosity. The conference room at Harmon's Finch and Patterson, Midwest Precision Works corporate attorneys, was all polished mahogany and hushed tones, a stark contrast to the honest clang of metal Arthur was used to. Veronica, flanked by a young lawyer named Justin Bellwether, who looked barely old enough to shave, exuded an air of bored impatience. "This is ridiculous," Veronica began, not even looking at the document Henry had placed squarely in front of her, Arthur's employment contract, open to the highlighted section 12. "We're implementing a new direction. That's cause enough." She waved a dismissive hand, as if Arthur's 18 years and the legally binding contract were minor inconveniences. Henry Phillips, 67, with the patient demeanor of a man who'd seen every corporate trick in the book, and then some, simply tapped a pen on the highlighted clause. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice calm and carrying the weight of decades in courtrooms. The definition of cause here is quite specific. As outlined in Appendix C, we're talking documented performance issues, ethical violations, criminal acts, implementing a new direction. I'm afraid, doesn't meet that threshold. As stipulated, termination without such documented cause requires severance equal to 24 months' current salary, approximately $320,000 in Mr. Jenkins' case. Young Justin Bellwether, the corporate lawyer, scanned the contract, his initial confidence visibly deflating as he read. He leaned over and whispered something to Veronica, who brushed him off with an irritated frown. He was resistant to change. Veronica interrupted, crossing her arms, her voice rising. "That's insubordination. And where is the documentation for this alleged insubordination, Miss Sterling?" Henry asked, his tone still mild, but with an edge of steel. "Written warnings, performance improvement plans, because Appendix C, as I'm sure Mr. Bellwether can confirm, requires a documented pattern, not a single instance or a vague assertion." Justin flipped through a surprisingly thin folder in front of him, finding nothing. His discomfort was palpable. Veronica's face tightened, a flush creeping up her neck. "Fine," she snapped. "So, we pay him a few months' severance and move on. This is a waste of time." 24 months, Miss Sterling," Henry corrected, his voice unwavering. "As stipulated." "That's ridiculous," she retorted, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "We'll offer 6 months. Take it or leave it." Arthur remained silent, watching her. In that moment, she reminded him so much of her father, the same stubborn set to her jaw, the same refusal to back down. But George's stubbornness, Arthur reflected, had always been in service of building something, of protecting quality, of standing by his word. Veronica's seemed aimed solely at tearing things down, at asserting her own dominance, regardless of the cost or the contract. It was a pale, destructive imitation of her father's strength. Henry Phillips slowly closed his weathered briefcase with a decisive click. "Then we'll proceed with legal action, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice now carrying a distinct chill. "Discovery should be particularly interesting, especially regarding the simultaneous termination of multiple employees over the age of 50. I believe Mr. Albright and Ms. Hayes, among others, might have compelling stories to tell. Age discrimination suits can be quite protracted and expensive." Justin Bellwether's eyes widened slightly. He leaned towards Veronica again, whispering something more urgent this time. She brushed him off again, her gaze fixed on Arthur. "Before you make threats, Mr. Jenkins," Veronica said, pointedly ignoring Henry, "you should know we're prepared to fight this. You'll be tied up in court for years." She leaned forward, a smirk playing on her lips. "Good luck finding another position at your age." It was the first time Arthur had spoken since the meeting began. His voice was quiet, devoid of anger, but carrying a weight that made Veronica pause. "I've got time, Miss Sterling," he said. "And as for finding another position, we'll make it known throughout the industry just how difficult Midwest Precision Works has become to deal with under its new leadership." He let that sink in. Reputation in their industry was everything. Just as Veronica opened her mouth to deliver another volley, the conference room door opened, and George Sterling stood in the doorway. Arthur hadn't seen him since his retirement party a few months prior. He looked thinner, paler, the lines on his face etched deeper, but his eyes, when they met Arthur's, were as sharp and knowing as ever. The air in the room suddenly crackled with a new tension. She tried to intimidate him, to make him feel small, but Arthur knew something Veronica was only beginning to learn. Real power isn't about shouting the loudest, is it? It's about knowing the facts, standing your ground, and sometimes, just sometimes, having an ace up your sleeve that your opponent never even bothered to look for. "Vanessa," George Sterling said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight that cut through the charged atmosphere of the conference room. "A word, outside, now, not a request." Veronica, who had been about to unleash another retort at Arthur, visibly bristled at her father's tone, but seemed to recognize the steel in it. She shot Arthur a venomous look, then pushed her chair back and followed George out through the heavy glass wall of the conference room. Arthur and Henry Phillips sat in silence, watching the muted pantomime unfold in the corridor. George was gesturing emphatically, his face earnest, while Veronica's posture grew increasingly defensive, her arms crossed, her head shaking. The argument, though inaudible, was clearly intense. Young Justin Bellwether fidgeted with his pen, studiously avoiding eye contact with either Arthur or Henry. When they returned, several long minutes later, Veronica wouldn't look at Arthur. Her face was tight with suppressed fury, her earlier bravado gone, replaced by a sullen resentment. George, on the other hand, looked weary but resolute. He turned to his lawyer. "Justin," George said, his voice firm, "prepare the severance agreement for Mr. Jenkins as written in the contract, full amount, no further discussion." "Dad," Vanessa started, her voice a sharp protest. "Not now, Vanessa." George cut her off, his gaze unwavering. He then turned to Arthur, a deep sigh escaping him. "I apologize, Arthur," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. "This isn't how I wanted things to end. This isn't how any of this should have happened." Arthur nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said between them. Not then. The damage was done, the lines drawn. As Arthur and Henry stood to leave, Veronica stepped in front of Arthur, her eyes glittering with a petty malice. "This isn't over, Jenkins," she hissed, her voice low. "I'll be reviewing all vendor relationships. Any company that hires you can forget about doing business with Midwest Precision Works. I'll see to it." George paled visibly at her words, but said nothing, a flicker of profound disappointment crossing his face. Arthur just nodded again, a faint, almost pitying smile on his lips. He was already thinking about his conversation with Douglas Clayton the day before, about the partnership offer Keystone Industrial Solutions had made, about the niche market for specialized hydraulic components that Midwest, under George's more cautious leadership, and now Veronica's dismissive one, had been ignoring for years. A market Keystone was poised to enter. "You're right about one thing, Miss Sterling," Arthur said quietly. "It isn't over. The severance payment, a little over $320 minus taxes, hit Arthur's bank account a week later. It was more money than he'd ever seen in one lump sum. He should have felt vindicated, triumphant even. Instead, he felt hollow. Money wasn't the point. He realized, not truly. Neither was revenge, not the bitter kind that consumes you. It was about something deeper, something tied to respect, to legacy, to the intrinsic value of a life's work. That same afternoon, he met Thomas Albright, Midwest's former head of engineering, at a small, unassuming diner halfway between their homes. The place was nearly empty at 3 o'clock, just a couple of truckers at the counter, and Arthur and Thomas tucked into a back booth. "Henry got me a year's severance," Thomas said, stirring his coffee without drinking it, his face etched with a weary bitterness. "Not as good as your deal, Arthur, but better than nothing. They want me to sign an NDA, though can't talk about proprietary processes or business practices for 5 years. He gave a bitter laugh. 40 years in engineering, and suddenly I can't talk about my own work. You signing it? Don't see much choice, Thomas admitted. His shoulders slumped. Got a granddaughter starting college next year. The tuition bills aren't going to pay themselves. Arthur listened, then pushed a business card across the table. Douglas Clayton, Keystone Industrial Solutions. Thomas read aloud, then looked up, a question in his eyes. He's looking for a consultant, Thomas, Arthur said. Someone who understands precision hydraulics. No NDA required, beyond the usual confidentiality about Keystone's own work. Of course. Thomas stared at the card, then at Arthur. Midwest would sue me if I took this. Veronica would come after me with everything she's got. Not if you're just advising on general industry standards, Thomas. Arthur countered gently. Nothing proprietary to Midwest about that. Your knowledge is yours. Thomas pocketed the card slowly. What's going on? Arthur? This isn't like you, stirring the pot. He paused, studying Arthur's face. You're up to something bigger, aren't you? Arthur hadn't told anyone about his full arrangement with Douglas yet, but Thomas deserved to know. They'd worked side by side for over a decade, through thick and thin. I'm partnering with Keystone, Thomas, Arthur said quietly. Douglas is bringing me in to head up a new division, specialized hydraulic components. The small batch, high-margin stuff Veronica thinks is a waste of time. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. The custom work, he breathed. George always said that was Midwest's future, and Vanessa's killing it to focus on mass production. Thinks she can compete with overseas manufacturers on price. She can't. Not with our labor costs. He leaned forward. Is that why you're telling me this? You think George is involved somehow? Arthur shook his head. No, but I had lunch with Jennifer Hayes yesterday. She said Vanessa's been liquidating equipment. The specialized machinery George bought last year for the custom work, she's already sold half of it. That's over $2 million in equipment, Thomas exclaimed, his eyes wide. At auction prices, she probably got 30 cents on the dollar. He sat back, understanding dawning on his face. She's stripping the company, converting assets to cash. Arthur nodded. And guess who's been reportedly buying property in Miami? Thomas. Jesus, Thomas whispered, running a hand over his face. Does George know? I don't think so, Arthur said. He built that company for legacy, not liquidation. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the implications, not just for them, the discarded veterans, but for the 100-plus employees still at Midwest, for George Sterling's entire life's work. What are you going to do, Arthur? Thomas finally asked. Arthur met his gaze, a new resolve hardening his own. Build something better, Thomas, he said simply. Something that respects both the past and the future. The position at Keystone, it's yours if you want it. It's about building something that lasts. That's all I've ever wanted to do. The money was there, more than he'd ever seen. But standing there, in his mind's eye, Arthur knew, deep in his bones, that true vindication wouldn't come from a bank account. It had to be built, brick by brick, with good people by his side. But where do you even start when you're building from the ashes of what was, and with the shadow of your old company's new, vindictive owner looming 2 months after the firing? Arthur Jenkins stood with Douglas Clayton, reviewing architectural plans spread across a makeshift table in a dusty, cavernous space. This was a converted warehouse on the east side of Indianapolis, still smelling faintly of old lumber and forgotten machinery, but soon to be the gleaming new home of Cornerstone Precision Hydraulics. The name had been Thomas Albright's idea. He'd joined them as chief engineer the week after Arthur's offer in the diner. We build from the corners up. Arthur, Thomas had said, a spark of his old enthusiasm returning. Solid foundations, impeccable integrity in every joint. That's how you make something that lasts. Douglas Clayton, a barrel-chested man with a full white beard and perpetually rolled-up sleeves. A man whose handshake felt like oak, beamed his approval. He was an investor who believed in people as much as P&L statements. He's 2 years from retirement himself, Arthur had explained to Thomas. Wants to back people who know what they're doing, then step aside and watch them fly. The transformation of the warehouse was happening at a surprisingly fast pace. Douglas had connections, and Arthur and Thomas had the know-how and a network of skilled tradespeople eager for work. Machine shops were confirmed, supplier contracts were being signed. They can deliver the first 5 specialized hydraulic units by next month, Douglas announced, pointing to a line on a Gantt T-chart. And our new CNC programmer starts Monday. He gave Arthur a knowing look. Jason Mitchell, isn't it former Midwest Precision Works employee? Said you recommended us? Arthur nodded. Jason was brilliant with computer modeling, a young talent who'd been criminally underpaid and stifled at Midwest. Veronica, in her infinite wisdom, had cut his department's budget by 30%, while, according to Jennifer Hayes' discreet intel, simultaneously doubling her own salary. Jason had quit 2 weeks after Arthur's departure, unwilling to watch his innovative projects die on the vine. How many does that make now from the old crew? Arthur, Douglas asked, whistling softly as Arthur ticked them off on his fingers. Thomas, Jason, 2 of the best tool and die makers, a senior machinist. That's 7 top performers. Douglas, and a few more, are making serious inquiries. Midwest is losing talent fast, Douglas observed, shaking his head. People follow good leadership, Arthur, and it sounds like Veronica Sterling isn't providing much of it. As if on cue, Arthur's phone buzzed, a text message from Jennifer Hayes. She was still working in Midwest's Quality Control Lab, 3 years shy of her own retirement, unable to afford to leave, but certainly willing to keep her eyes and ears open for her old colleagues. The message contained a photo of an internal Midwest memo. Arthur's stomach tightened as he read it. Production delays mounting. Quality control issues flagged on 3 major product lines. And, most damningly, 3 major clients, including Great Lakes Manufacturing. One of Midwest's biggest and oldest accounts were threatening to pull their multi-million-dollar contracts over missed deadlines and substandard parts. Arthur showed the message to Douglas, who adjusted his reading glasses to see better. Just as we predicted, Douglas said, his voice grim. The brain drain is affecting their output already. She's cut out the heart and soul, and now the body is failing. Arthur pocketed his phone, feeling no satisfaction in the news, only a profound sadness. Midwest Precision Works, under George Sterling, had employed families he'd known for years, people with mortgages to pay, kids in college, elderly parents in nursing homes. Their suffering wasn't his goal. We should reach out to Great Lakes Manufacturing. Douglas, Arthur said, his voice decisive. Let them know Cornerstone Precision Hydraulics will be fully operational in 60 days. Let them know we have the expertise they remember, the quality they expect. Douglas nodded, already making a note. Already scheduled a preliminary meeting with their purchasing manager for next week, he said with a slight smile. They seemed very eager to talk. Arthur stood and walked to a newly installed window, overlooking what would soon be Cornerstone's main production floor. Workers were already installing the first pieces of heavy equipment, the bones of something new, something being built on a foundation of respect for experience and a commitment to innovation. It was a stark contrast to the news from Midwest. They say people follow good leadership, and it seemed the market was beginning to agree. As Cornerstone began to rise, built on the very principles Veronica Sterling had so carelessly discarded, what was truly happening back at the company she was so keen to modernize. Sometimes, Arthur mused, the market has its own way of teaching harsh lessons, lessons that echo far beyond a balance sheet, lessons about the irreplaceable value of human capital and trust. The quiet hum of activity below him was a symphony of potential, a future being forged not from arrogance, but from the combined wisdom of those who knew how to build things that last. The call Arthur Jenkins never expected, yet somehow wasn't entirely surprised by, came as he stood on the mezzanine of the nearly completed Cornerstone facility, overlooking the newly installed array of gleaming CNC machines and assembly stations. The hum of activity below was a testament to weeks of relentless work by his new team. His phone rang, and George Sterling's name lit up the screen. Arthur took a deep breath. "I should take this," he said to Thomas Albright, who was beside him reviewing a complex hydraulic schematic. Thomas nodded, understanding, and stepped away to give him privacy. "George," Arthur answered, his voice even. "Arthur." George Sterling's voice sounded tired, defeated, a hollow echo of the robust man who had once been his mentor. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "George." A heavy sigh came through the receiver. "I know what you're doing, Arthur, the new company, Cornerstone, the Midwest employees you're hiring away." Arthur said nothing. It wasn't illegal, given the circumstances. It wasn't even unethical. It was simply good business, and a lifeline for talented people Veronica had cast adrift. "I'm not calling to ask you to stop, Arthur," George continued, his voice raspy. "I wouldn't have the right, even if I wanted to." Another pause, heavier this time. "I'm calling to ask for your help." That caught Arthur completely off guard. "Help. After everything." "What kind of help, George?" he asked, his mind racing, trying to comprehend what the founder of Midwest Precision Works could possibly want from the man his daughter had so unceremoniously fired. "The kind of help that might save what's left of my company," George said, the words laced with a raw pain that was palpable even over the phone. He paused, as if gathering the strength to voice the full extent of the disaster. "Vanessa, she's been selling off assets. Arthur, good machinery, essential equipment, going for pennies on the dollar. She's cutting corners on quality, trying to meet price points we were never designed to meet. Our reputation, it's in tatters. The board's concerned. Hell, I'm more than concerned. I'm terrified I'm watching my life's work burn to the ground." Arthur listened, a complex swirl of emotions churning within him. There was a grim vindication, yes, but also a profound sadness for George, for the legacy that was being squandered. "Why tell me this, George?" Arthur asked, genuinely curious. "Why come to me? Because you're the only one who knows every part of the operation." "Arthur," George said, his voice cracking slightly, "you're the only one who ever truly understood how all the pieces fit together. The only one who might see a path forward, if there even is one." Another long pause. Then, so quiet Arthur almost missed it. "And because I should have listened to you months ago when you warned me she wasn't ready. I was a fool, Arthur, a proud, foolish old man, and I let my hope for her blind me to what you were trying to tell me." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, leaning against the railing. He thought about all those years working alongside George, the shared pride in a job well done, the hundreds of people who had trusted them to make good decisions, to provide steady employment, to build something they could all be proud of. He looked down at the bustling floor of Cornerstone Precision Hydraulics, at the small but growing operation he and Thomas and Douglas were building, an operation founded on the very principles Midwest was now abandoning, the future he was forging out of the ashes of betrayal. "What exactly are you asking, George?" Arthur asked, his voice softer now. "Come to my house tonight," George pleaded. 7 o'clock. Bring Thomas if he's willing. The board wants to meet to discuss options." "Options?" Arthur queried. "Yes." George's voice strengthened slightly, a flicker of the old decisiveness returning. "Options, Arthur, including a change in leadership, a drastic one." All those years working alongside George, building something they were both proud of. Now, the man who had stood by, however passively, while his legacy was dismantled and Arthur himself was humiliated, was asking him, Arthur Jenkins, to be its savior. What would you do? Could you find it in yourself to help? After everything, the irony was almost too much to bear. Yet, as he looked at the earnest, hard-working faces on the Cornerstone shop floor below, men and women building their futures, he also thought of the faces still at Midwest, caught in the crossfire of Veronica's mismanagement, their futures uncertain. "I'll be there, George," Arthur said finally, his decision made. But I'm not promising anything. Fair enough, Arthur, George said, relief evident in his voice. And Arthur, yes, thank you. Thank you for still taking my calls. Arthur hung up, the weight of George's request, of the entire situation, settling heavily upon him. The path forward was anything but clear, fraught with risks and old wounds. But one thing was certain. The storm he had calmly driven into months ago was about to reach its most turbulent point. 6 months after being told he was dragging the company down. Arthur Jenkins stood in the back of Midwest Precision Works' main conference room. It was the quarterly all-hands meeting, and Veronica Sterling was at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by her new executive team, mostly fresh-faced MBAs, all looking decidedly nervous. Arthur wasn't supposed to speak until the end. That had been the discreet agreement with George and the increasingly alarmed Midwest board members, who were now quietly seated amongst the rank and file. Let Veronica present her quarterly results first, they'd said. Give her the chance to explain the 37% drop in revenue, the lost contracts, the catastrophic quality control failures that had become the talk of the industry. Veronica was halfway through a slick presentation, her voice confident as she blamed unforeseen market conditions and legacy inefficiencies for the company's disastrous performance, when she finally noticed Arthur standing quietly near the back. Her flow faltered, her eyes narrowing. "What is he doing here?" she demanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger in Arthur's direction, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Charles Sterling, seated amongst the board members, looking older and more frail, but with a newfound resolve in his eyes, nodded almost imperceptibly to the chairman of the board, a stern-faced man named Walter Beck. Walter stood slowly. "Vanessa," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of decades of leadership. "The board has reached a decision regarding the company's leadership and its future direction." Veronica's face went white. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her gaze darting from Walter to her father, then finally landing on Arthur with a look of pure disbelief and fury. "Stanley," she choked out his name, as if it were a curse. The chairman continued, turning pointedly towards Arthur. "Mr. Jenkins, perhaps you would like to explain the new arrangement." Arthur stepped forward, holding a folder, the very same one Henry Phillips had prepared for his severance meeting 6 months earlier, but its contents now very, very different. "Midwest Precision Works," Arthur began, his voice steady and clear, resonating through the suddenly silent room, "is merging with Cornerstone Precision Hydraulics." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled employees. "The board," Arthur continued, "approved the acquisition agreement this morning." Veronica laughed, a short, sharp, hysterical sound. "This is absurd. I'm the majority shareholder. This company is mine." "No, Vanessa," George Sterling said, standing slowly, leaning heavily on a cane Arthur hadn't seen him use before. "You hold 20%. I retain 51%, a controlling interest, which I have now voted in favor of this merger." He looked at his daughter, not with anger, but with a profound, weary sadness. It was the only way to save what's left. Arthur slid the folder across the table towards Veronica. "Cornerstone Precision Hydraulics will absorb Midwest's Custom Hydraulics division, its most valuable remaining asset," he explained. "The rest of Midwest's operations will continue under new leadership." "My leadership," a firm voice said from the doorway. Thomas Albright stepped into the room, his presence commanding, a quiet confidence radiating from him. Veronica stared, dumbfounded, as she flipped through the documents in the folder, her hands shaking, the color draining completely from her face. This is, she stammered. "This is business, Miss Sterling," Arthur finished for her, his voice devoid of malice, stating a simple fact. Nothing personal. A year after the merger, Arthur Jenkins stood with George Sterling on the newly expanded observation platform. Below them, the integrated production facility hummed with efficient activity, housing both the nimble innovation of Cornerstone Precision and the salvaged expertise of Midwest Custom Hydraulics. Workers moved with purpose between stations, the rhythm of well-maintained machinery creating a symphony of productivity that Arthur had missed dearly during his months away. George leaned heavily on his cane, His physical health hadn't improved much, but his spirit, Arthur noted, was markedly lighter. Watching the company he'd founded not just survive, but begin to thrive again under principled leadership, had clearly been the best medicine. Quarterly numbers came in this morning, George said quietly, handing Arthur a report. Best in 5 years. Arthur, profit margins are up. Employee retention has stabilized. We've even filed for 3 new patents on some of Thomas's latest designs. Arthur nodded, scanning the figures, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over him. Vanessa called yesterday. George continued, his gaze distant. From Miami, after the merger, she'd taken her settlement, a fraction of what she'd hoped for after her asset stripping was factored in, and disappeared. No goodbyes, no apologies. Arthur raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She's starting a consulting firm, George added, a wry twist to his lips. Asked if I'd invest? Asked if you'd invest. Arthur? Will you? Arthur asked. George shook his head. I told her to come back to Indianapolis first. Learn the business from the ground up, the way I did, the way you did. She hung up on me. He smiled sadly. But she called back this morning, asked if the offer to learn still stood. Below them, Arthur watched Jason Mitchell, their star CNC programmer, patiently training 2 new apprentices on their latest system. Jennifer Hayes, now head of quality for the entire merged operation, was in her lab coat, inspecting components with her characteristic meticulous precision. Thomas Albright was at a workstation, sketching a design modification by hand before transferring it to a computer, a perfect blend of old-school know-how and new-age tech, experience and innovation, working side by side, not in conflict, not one replacing the other, but building something stronger, something better, together. You know, Arthur, George said, his voice reflective, when I wrote that severance clause into your contract all those years ago, I never imagined for a moment how it would all turn out. Arthur smiled, a genuine, warm smile. Neither did I. George, neither did I. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the company they had both helped build, in their own ways, continue to grow, a testament to resilience and the enduring power of doing the right thing. Arthur Jenkins hadn't set out to take over his old company. He'd simply refused to be devalued, refused to let good people and a worthy legacy be cast aside by arrogance and short-sightedness. He chose to build, not to break. And in doing so, he not only salvaged a precious legacy, but forged an even brighter new one. It makes you think, doesn't it, about the quiet strength that lies in experience, in integrity, in the steadfast belief in one's own worth, about the lessons life teaches. Lessons that, while sometimes painfully expensive, are always worth the price if they change how we see the world, and more importantly, how we value each other. What forgotten strengths or overlooked details in your own life, in your own journey, might just be waiting for their moment to shine, to become the cornerstone of something new and wonderful? Perhaps it's worth a quiet reflection tonight. If Arthur's journey and the choices he made resonated with you, consider sharing your thoughts or a similar experience in the comments below. And if you appreciate stories about resilience, quiet triumphs, and the enduring power of experience, perhaps you'll join us for more.